Some friends decided they would take the next step in their cave diving journey and attempt to enter the uncharted sections of Radium Spring Cave to map it. They wanted to make a name for themselves, and although they didn't have the experience or training to handle this dangerous expedition, they attempted it anyway. Viewer discretion is advised. Murray Anderson heard about Radium Springs Cave through a friend he met in a caving group. This cave has many passages that no one has seen, which intrigued Murray. It is rumored that an unmapped section is just past a cavern deep in the cave. This uncharted part of the cave is said to be the most beautiful underground cavern in the world. No one has ever been past this room because of the obstacles along the way and the danger of the operation. This fascinated Murray, and his friends said it was a constant topic of conversation he initiated within their group. Tight passages must be carefully navigated, and perfect air management must be used to maneuver compressed, sharp tunnels. In this cave, a diver must remove their tank and tunnel through a part of the bottom of the cave lake to enter the cavern. This is the most claustrophobic and dangerous section. If you get stuck here, you are not getting out. You must angle your body while inhaling to compress your lungs and hope you squeeze through. Just past this is the unmapped section. If you make it this far, despite the extreme risks, so the story goes, you are now in the most beautiful cavern in the world. By the time Murray Anderson was in his late 20s, he was already an experienced US Navy SEAL with more than 200 hours of dive experience. And when he wasn't working for the government, he spent much of his free time exploring underwater cave complexes in and around Georgia. However, all that disappeared when he and his friend Donald entered the Radium Springs Cave System in 1995. Murray and his friend broke virtually every cave diving rule on this expedition. The divers exceeded their training and certification requirements for this planned journey. They did not run a continuous guideline from the surface of the cave. Robert had only one light source and did not follow the standard cave diving rule of thirds for air management. But in this case, a local cave diving instructor noted that the rule of thirds is not considered conservative enough for this cave because of its complexity. Radium Springs is located in southwest Georgia, approximately 12 miles or 20 kilometers east of Albany, Georgia, in the United States. It was initially called Blue Springs, but the name was changed in 1925 when radium was first detected in the clear blue water. We now know that radium exposure can cause a number of serious health problems like anemia, cataracts, and cancer. Extended exposure can even cause death. Radium was thought to cure common ailments like psoriasis, asthma, and rheumatoid arthritis. Because of what happened in this story, the cave complex beneath Radium Springs is no longer open to the public, but experienced divers occasionally explore for scientific and geological purposes. Open water diving is inherently dangerous even under ideal conditions, but cave diving is even more dangerous. Nearly all divers account for and contend with equipment malfunctions and nitrogen narcosis. However, cave divers also worry about getting stuck in tiny crevices and getting hopelessly lost in a confusing labyrinth of passages. Even so, cave diving and open water diving have one thing in common. Run-of-the-mill problems can spiral out of control with amazing speed. As situations go from bad to worse in a matter of seconds, even the most experienced divers can panic and make poor decisions that can ultimately lead to their deaths. Most of us can't imagine anything more terrifying than strapping on bulky underwater breathing gear and venturing into a dark, mysterious, and downright intimidating cave filled with sediment-laden water. So dark you can't see a foot in front of you. Even so, recreational diving has existed for ages, but it didn't gain traction in the United States until the 1950s. But back then, the diving gear and training are far from what they are today. There's no doubt that Murray's US Navy training was decent, but most of his work was open water diving. Nonetheless, he was one of the most experienced and respected divers in the diving club because many of the other members were weekend warriors with little or no formal training, so they kind of all looked up to him. The club's amateur divers always jumped at the opportunity to get into the water with Murray because he knew a lot more than them and he could teach them what he knew. Murray had been thinking about diving Radium Springs for some time, and when he pitched the idea to a fellow club member, Donald Garreau, he was more than eager to join Murray. By mid-1955, Murray and Donald were both experienced cave divers who had been in some pretty hairy situations over the years. As such, they were definitely aware of the risks associated with their pastime of choice. They took safety seriously, but for them, the danger was part of the allure. The fact was that Murray and Donald were adrenaline junkies long before the term was ever coined. They also enjoyed camaraderie and the thrill they got from exploring caves that few people, or perhaps anyone, had ever entered. Decades later, divers and geologists determined that Radium Springs Cave Complex was 1,500 feet or 475 meters long and had an odd honeycomb structure. But in 1955, Murray and Donald had no idea how big it was, how many passages and chambers there were, how deep it went, or what unknown offshoots lay within. They were both excited to start the expedition when they arrived at the cave one Friday morning in the summer of 1955. Murray and Donald were looking forward to a deep and uncharted dive, but they also wanted to explore and map as much of the cave as possible. And to make the most of their limited time underwater, they decided they'd split up shortly after entering the cave. This would allow them to cover far more ground than they'd be able to if they stayed together. That said, it was definitely risky from a safety standpoint because they wouldn't be able to help one another if something went wrong. But under the circumstances, it seemed like a reasonable trade-off. Murray and Donald began preparing their gear and suiting up shortly after arriving. However, it's worth noting that their equipment was far heavier and bulkier than diving gear is today. High-quality commercial diving equipment wasn't available back then. To save as much of their hard-earned money as possible, many divers like Murray made their own gear and oxygen tanks using parts from discarded equipment and odds and ends they could find at local hardware stores. It was nearly noon by the time Murray and Donald waded out from the shore into the blue water. Then, when they got about chest deep, they inserted their regulators into their mouths, dipped below the surface, and began the short descent to the partially concealed 3-foot cave opening at the bottom of the spring. Before entering the cave, they decided not to anchor a safety line at the entrance. At least in theory, the line would lead them to the exit if they got lost or had a critical equipment failure. Safety lines are especially important when divers are exploring cave systems they're not familiar with. And this is particularly true in sediment-filled caves where visibility can drop to nearly zero in the blink of an eye. Then, Murray and Donald slipped through the narrow entrance and into the cave. While their eyes adjusted to the darkness, they slowly moved their homemade flashlights from side to side to see which direction the main passage led. At that point, they also noticed that the cave floor was covered in a thick layer of sediment. To avoid agitating it and dispersing it into the water, they knew they had to keep their movements to an absolute minimum and swim as close to the top of the main passage as possible. They also had to be careful with their fins and kick them out sideways and not up and down. This is especially hard to do in a tight, restricting cave passage. As they slipped under a massive rock overhang and entered the main passage, the last bits of natural light quickly disappeared behind them. The dive was pretty fun for them and uneventful early on, and then they swam deeper and deeper into the cave. The water was remarkably clear, and their flashlights were providing more than enough light for them to easily navigate through the passages. Murray and Donald came across a number of side chutes that radiated outward from the main passage. They peered into a few of them, but it was impossible to tell how long they were and where exactly they led, and if they were even passable. By then, they'd only been in the water about 30 minutes, but when they were just 200 feet or 60 meters into the cave, Donald decided that he'd seen enough and he wanted to get out. He was just starting to panic in there and something felt very off. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew that if he kept going in deeper, things would have gotten very bad. He and Murray just kind of motioned at each other under the water. Donald told Murray that he was going to go back, and indicated that Murray should really come back with him. However, Murray wasn't ready to call it a day because he hadn't explored that much or done anything particularly challenging. At the time, he felt that he didn't do what he came there to do, so he was going to continue on. He probably also wondered why Donald was so ready to pack it up so quickly into the dive. They planned on splitting up and mapping portions of the cave that had never been explored. And even without Donald, that's exactly what Murray intended to do. Using hand gestures and facial expressions, Murray made it clear that he wasn't ready to surface. Donald wasn't taking no for an answer and tried his best to persuade Murray to come with him. And with that, he gave Murray the thumbs up to tell him he was out of there. Then, Donald turned 180 degrees and swam back to the cave entrance, leaving his friend all alone in the darkness. At that point, the water was still relatively clear because very little sediment had been agitated. He had no way of knowing it, but as soon as he was out of sight, Murray entered a narrow side chute off the main passage. A few minutes later, Donald exited the cave, swam to shore, and began climbing out of his cumbersome gear. Meanwhile, Murray was venturing deeper and deeper into the cave system. Now, he was in near total darkness. The light from his homemade flashlight was beginning to dim. But the cave entrance was just a few hundred feet behind him, so he didn't think he had anything to worry about. But at that moment, he realized he'd been careless. He'd been so intent on what he was doing that he inadvertently agitated much of the sediment resting on the cave floor. Now, much of it had become dispersed into the water, and the visibility in the tiny passage dropped to nearly zero in a matter of seconds. The dim beam from his homemade flashlight was completely out in the sediment-choked water. In fact, visibility was so bad that Murray could barely see his own hands even when they were just a few inches in front of his face. He took some comfort in the fact that he was just a stone's throw away from the entrance to the cave. However, he knew it was imperative that he got back into the main passage as quickly as possible. Murray grasped at the walls, chaotically hoping to find the opening that led to the main passage. But he only felt solid rock all around him. As panic set in, he began breathing far more heavily than normal. This is a normal response in stressful situations, but it meant that the oxygen left in his own tank wouldn't last nearly as long as it was supposed to. By then, he'd been alone in the cave for more than an hour. With the air he had left, he was rapidly approaching the point of no return. As an experienced diver, he knew that escalating events like the one he was experiencing sometimes led to death. Back on the shore, Donald was totally unaware that his friend was in such dire straits. However, Murray had more experience and was a bigger risk taker than he was, so he wasn't necessarily surprised that his friend was waiting until the last possible minute to surface. Then again, Murray took dive safety very seriously, so Donald's emotions seesawed between confidence and concern. As the minutes ticked away, he hoped his friend would finally surface and swim to the shore, and that they could put the matter behind them once and for all. But he eventually realized Murray couldn't possibly have any oxygen left, and that's when he knew something must have gone horribly wrong. At that point, Donald had three choices. He could sit tight and hope that his friend would miraculously reappear, or he could climb back into his gear and swim back into the cave to see if he could find and rescue Murray before it was too late. And last, he could call the authorities and report Murray missing and hope that competent rescuers would arrive sooner rather than later. Donald considered re-entering the water, but he was already tired and had used most of his oxygen from earlier in the dive. Ultimately, he erred on the side of caution and reported Murray missing. He also managed to track down two fellow divers from the diving club, but the sun had already set by the time they arrived at Radium Springs. They all knew that Murray was probably dead, but time was still of the essence because there was a slim chance that he found an air-filled chamber and was just waiting to be rescued. With that in mind, they threw on their gear and slipped into the spring and swam to the cave entrance like Murray and Donald had done earlier that day. They reached the entrance to the cave in a matter of minutes. The three men now had stronger lights and fresh batteries, but the visibility was still poor because the sediment hadn't settled yet. Donald entered the cave first. Then, after the other two divers connected to the safety line, he led them to the point where he left Murray just a few hours before. But neither Murray or any of his gear was anywhere to be found. They spent nearly 2 hours searching a number of passageways, but they became too exhausted and they were running out of oxygen. This meant that they were putting their own lives at risk, so they retraced their steps and ascended to the surface and swam back to the shore empty-handed. By then, Donald was so emotionally drained and physically exhausted that his two friends were barely able to pull him to shore before he collapsed in front of a heap of people that had congregated near the beach. When the Navy found out that one of its frogmen was missing, a team of senior divers was flown in from the naval base in Charleston, South Carolina. But they didn't arrive until early the following morning, and by then, Murray had been in the cave for nearly 20 hours. Scores of curious people were camped out on the beach, and dozens more watched from further back as the Navy divers slipped into their gear and entered the water. The divers immediately swam to the bottom of the spring, located the safety line, and entered the cave system through the narrow entrance. Many rescue and recovery operations are long and tedious, and oftentimes the victim or victims are never found. However, this wasn't the case with Murray. Within a matter of minutes, the divers found him floating near the top of the cave, exactly where Donald said they'd parted ways approximately 200 feet into the cave. When they found Murray, his regulator was no longer in his mouth, and the flashlight that had failed him the day before was dangling from a lanyard attached to his diving harness. Donald's heart sank when the Navy divers told him where they found Murray's body. They knew that he and two club member divers who searched for him the previous day must have swam right under him. However, they weren't able to see him because the water clarity was so poor. Sadly, Donald also realized that Murray must have been dead at that point, because his oxygen would have run out hours before. What made the whole thing even more tragic was the number of careless and altogether avoidable errors that contributed to Murray's untimely death. First, he and Donald didn't begin their dive until noon. This probably didn't seem like a big deal at the time because they only planned on exploring in the cave for an hour or two. But when things went south and precious minutes began ticking away, the first rescuers weren't able to begin with their search until after the sun had gone down. Needless to say, this made things even more difficult and treacherous than they would have been otherwise. Another fatal mistake was that Murray stayed behind when Donald exited the cave. Cave diving is hazardous enough when two or more divers stick together, but the danger increases exponentially when a diver sets out on his or her own. And last, Murray may have sealed his own fate when he didn't use the safety line to go down into the cave. This was a particularly egregious error in judgment because he wasn't familiar with the cave's layout. At least officially, Murray Anderson was one of the first known cave diving fatalities in the United States. But if there's a bright spot to this tragedy, it's that his death led to a number of changes that may have saved more than a few lives over the following years. Namely, that divers shouldn't dive alone, that they should have at least 2 flashlights with them at all times, and that they should stay fastened to the safety line whenever possible. And that they should manage their own oxygen reserves in accordance with the rule of thirds, or use a system that's even more conservative than that. And that's all I have for today's video, and I want to thank you for watching until the end. If this story moves you, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. I look forward to seeing you at the next one.